This is Faux-Authentic History.
Hello, and welcome to the show. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Brian Young.
And today, we're going to explore a bit of the paranormal. And this is fairly recent history, but given how contested reports of otherworldly phenomenon on our Earth are, I thought it would be worth examining as part of a larger historical context of the mystical and the paranormal, because it does reach back quite far in its lore.
For framework for this episode, we're going to have to talk a bit about the Museum of the Weird. And this was a place that's almost exclusively the stuff of legend. It's rumored to be a locale where supernatural objects were housed and protected, but we had no accounts of its actual existence, just some theoretical sketches and a lot of speculation about what it might be and what sort of items it might include.
And also at play in this particular incident were two ancient groups that were part of a long, mystical pas de deux through time. They had been at war for quite some time. The Wardens, which was an adaptation of the Old English word weird, were tasked with guarding the fate of the world and keeping the supernatural items of the world safe, both from people who didn't understand them and from entities that would use them malevolently.
The Society of Shadows was the opposite rival faction to the Wardens, and they too wanted to gain possession of the world's supernatural assets, but their aim was to use them for their own gain with no regard for the consequences to others. The Society of Shadows was basically untouchable, too powerful for humans to fight, and so they had to acquiesce to their demands.
But at the time of the events we're talking about today, two of the key players involved had no knowledge that they were entangled in this metaphysical tug-of-war. They didn't know about the Museum of the Weird, the Wardens, or the Society of Shadows.
So this particular incident involved members of the Keep family. Arthur and Ellen Keep owned a small, unique shop attached to their New Orleans home called Keep It Weird. The shop traded in curios, antiques, and oddities, many of which were associated with the occult and mystical.
And the Keep's two children were both teenagers at the time of the events that we're talking about today. Maxwell was similar to his parents in that he was bookish and a little nerdy, and he was kind of into this sort of stock that they had in their shop. And his sister Melody was very different from Maxwell and their parents. She did not really excel academically, and she was an athlete. She excelled instead at lacrosse, but both Melody and Maxwell worked in the family store.
One evening, as the Keep kids were settling into their rooms for the night, they were startled by a strange sound and rumbling in the house. Both kids ran from their rooms and followed the noise down to their parents' office, and that's when things began to get strange.
Right, so the kids opened the door to their parents' private study to find the elder Keeps engaged in battle with a small army of bizarre creatures that appeared to be horrific combinations of multiple animals. So, a bear with tentacle arms, and a snake with wings and a lion's head, and a shark with an eagle's body and a lizard tail were among the odd beasts that were attacking the pair.
I suppose there's worse things you could walk in on your parents doing.
I'm not even going to touch that.
When Maxwell and Melody arrived, their parents immediately yelled for them to leave. But as the kids watched, both their mother and father were seized by the hybrid animals and taken into what appeared to be another dimension. The remaining creatures then turned on the kids. Melody tried to fend them off with her lacrosse stick, which she'd grabbed when she left her room, and when she finally made contact with one of them, she realized that they were taxidermy animals filled with sawdust.
Yeah, so they were somehow animated and had intent, so that I can't imagine how mind-blowing that must have been in that moment. But despite the fact that they should have been inanimate, those beasts did continue to attack until another person suddenly appeared in the melee and began firing a weapon. It had two barrels, one looked like an angel and one looked like a devil, and it seemed to shoot ghostly skeletons from those barrels, which managed to subdue this taxidermy army.
And this man was as unique in appearance as you might expect someone with a ghost gun to be. His clothes seemed to be a mix of 18th century privateer style and military surplus accessories, and in addition to his strange pistol, he also carried a cutlass.
Melody and Maxwell fairly quickly realized, though, that this mysterious stranger was in fact no stranger at all, but their Uncle Roland, who they had actually never met, which explains their initial lack of recognition. But they had barely begun to all speak to one another and sort out who was who when another creature appeared, this time something called a Candleman. And Candlemen look exactly like what you are probably imagining based on their name. They're humanoid creatures made entirely of wax, with multiple wicks burning from their upper torso and sometimes appendages.
Along with the Candleman, a specter with a feminine form appeared before the newly united trio. It was Despina, a part of the Society of Shadows. She immediately made a demand to Roland and the Keep kids that they must return the coffin clock before the Candleman burned down, or they would never see Arthur and Ellen again.
The house was on fire at this point, and Uncle Roland quickly sprang into action, grabbing the Candleman and calling for both Maxwell and Melody to follow him as he entered their parents' private study, which is a slightly different area than their private library. It was a room that, in fact, the kids had never been allowed in before, and Roland, once he was within, gestured to a door that was there that had this massive eye ornamentation on it, which also contained in its iris a lock. And he asked the kids if either of them had the key, and while each of them had a unique key on a pendant, which they were both very cagey about explaining to one another because the fact that they possessed them was news to everyone, neither of those keys worked on the door.
But while the kids had been dodging each other's questions, Roland had been rooting around in Arthur's desk and managed to find the correct key for the door, which, once opened, was a portal of some sort. He led the stunned kids into a massive space that he called the Museum of the Weird. It was filled with artifacts neither Melody nor Maxwell had ever seen, though apparently their parents had regular access to.
Uncle Roland told Max and Melody that he would go find the coffin clock and then return it to Despina. And he left the kids to fend for themselves in the museum. But Roland was only gone a very short while when another attack occurred. This time, statues from the museum began pursuing the Keep kids, and as they struggled to fight back, Roland emerged suddenly from what seemed to be another dimension.
The man was in rough shape. He was battered, and his lower legs were gone. He referenced the mysterious keys Maxwell and Melody had and told them that they would have to take on the mission themselves, that it had always been them that should have gone after the clock, and then he lost consciousness.
So at this point, Melody's first instinct, and I don't think anyone could fault her, was to run. So she threw open the door that led back to their destroyed home, but this was a terrifying enough prospect that Roland actually revived, and he rather quickly stopped her by using yet another piece of unusual gear, a grappling spider, to pull her back into the museum. And he explained that because of the mystical nature of the family's home and possessions, there was actually no home to return to, not even a burned out one.
Instead, he brought them to the museum's library, where they could learn from tomes that answered questions, but where a key element to the acquisition of the coffin clock was kept. The element was in fact a chair, an odd-looking armchair with a design on its back cushion that resembled a contorted face.
Despite serious obstruction, because it turns out that magical books can become angry and assemble themselves into a monster, the kids were able to get the chair, which walked on command out of the library. But even after their exit from the perils of the library, they were then confronted with yet another problem. Mummies.
In fact, one enchanted problem after another seemed to find Maxwell and Melody until Max had the idea to sit in the chair and command it to run. And that got them away from the various paranormal predators they were beset by, and once they'd cleared those problems and regrouped, the chair was repurposed as a means of locomotion for Uncle Roland, who still had only wisps of greenish smoke where his shins and feet should have been.
Roland led Melody and Maxwell to the museum's living quarters, which they were able to fortify for safety. And as dangers from without the group were at that point managed, tensions within the threesome became more apparent. Maxwell and Melody were really irritated that their uncle was less than forthright with information. They were still struggling to understand what was happening, and while he did seem to understand the situation, he did not seem terribly interested in explaining things.
Eventually and begrudgingly, he meted out a small amount of knowledge. The Enchanted Chair was part of a larger group, a literal living room set that could summon the clock the Society of Shadows was after once all pieces had been assembled. Apparently, this function of the unique furniture had only recently been discovered by Maxwell and Melody's parents.
Roland also disclosed that he and the Keep parents were all Wardens, but that they went about the job very differently. And both of the Keep kids had noticed that their father in particular would bristle when Roland's name was brought up. So their uncle mentioning the disparity of his methodology to their parents, to them started to make some sense of their father Arthur's behavior.
Temporarily appeased, the kids and their uncle all settled down for some much-needed rest, but in the morning, an entirely new sort of surprise greeted them. This time it was neither monster nor angry beast, but 3 seemingly spectral characters claiming to be the Wardens, and warning Max and Melody to cease their current quest as they would doom the world if they continued.
And in addition to these verbal admonitions, the 3 ghostly wardens also had a small army of mummies, although they called them husks along with them, and they sent the husks after the 2 keep kids, who naturally ran when all of this started happening. And after a series of odd twists and turns throughout the museum, and through what appeared to be a ghostly aquarium, and then a trapdoor, and an army of angry mushroom people, the kids finally managed to befriend the mushrooms and get them to help.
Thanks to the guidance of the mushroom people, which are fairly small but dangerous in groups, the kids found the table from the living room. But before they could bring it back to Roland, they once again found mummies on their tails. And this time, they were not so lucky at evading them, and they were captured and brought before one of the ghostly wardens.
Yeah, they did have the presence of mind to sort of yell at the table to go back to the living quarters, so it headed off without them. And then this ghostly warden identified himself as Ephraim Fenton Whetstone, the chief warden. And he explained that, in fact, he was no ghost, but merely a projection. His human body was very much alive, but elsewhere, deep in a trance. And he also told them that he was their parents' boss, and, more troublingly, that they should not trust their Uncle Roland. Whetstone told Maxwell and Melody that the coffin clock was in fact an actual coffin. It was a receptacle that was intended to bind and contain the Reaper King. And the last time the Reaper King had been let loose, according to Whetstone, the Black Death tore through Europe.
Despina was the Reaper King's human mistress, who he made undying by forging an armor from her shadow that made her untouchable to other Reapers. In turn, Despina made all the Society of Shadows undying in the same way, and as part of Despina's plan, she wanted the Reaper King back so they could wipe out the living and rule together, which was apparently what they were trying to do in Europe in the 14th century.
And just in case that name does ring a bell, and it's sometimes pronounced slightly different ways, it is unclear whether this is indeed the same Despina that was the daughter of Demeter and Poseidon. But that connection to the mystical and the mythology of that Despina as a mistress figure certainly suggests somehow that it's all connected. But that, however, remains unverified.
So the head warden's story continued that to end the Black Death, the Keep's ancestor, Enkidu Keep, captured the Reaper King in the coffin clock. The clock was then hidden in what the Wardens called the crawlway, and this was a sort of space between spaces, an alternate dimension, and the Reaper King himself was trapped between moments. The clock was stopped in between chimes, so he could not emerge.
And the binding spell put on the clock meant that only the youngest members of the Keep family could open it, and that was why Roland needed Melody and Maxwell.
All of this meant that in order to comply with the Whetstones' request, the kids would have to give up on getting their parents, Arthur and Ellen, back. And they weren't willing to just let them go, so once again the Warden's husks were sent after them.
But this time, Maxwell's interest in the paranormal actually gave them a bit of an assist. Earlier in their explorations of the museum, he had pulled an amulet from a corpse that they'd found, and he felt certain that this amulet must have some power, but he didn't know what at the time that he grabbed it. So in this moment of peril, he tried to use it to command the husks to stop, and it worked.
The brother and sister were able to run for the sanctuary of the fortified living quarters. There they found Uncle Roland, who'd been convinced that something had happened to him when the table from the living room arrived. They'd commanded it to go to the living quarters when they found it, as we said earlier, but they were nowhere in sight.
Yeah, he was kind of the classic picture of like a frightened, angry parent when their kid has not come home. Melody and Max, however, confronted their uncle about his deceptions, and he told them that he had never intended to tell them that Despina and the Reaper King were trying to destroy humanity and take over the earth, because he didn't want to worry them, and because he had a plan to stop that possibility. So Roland told his niece and nephew that his entire plan hinged on making it look as though they were in fact going to go through with the exchange of the clock for the keeps, but that his intent had always been to deceive Despina just long enough to get his family members back.
Choosing to trust Roland, the kids began to also hunt for the sofa to complete the living room and conjure the clock. They were able to secure the sofa, this time battling some rather malicious and deranged garden plants, and assemble the living room. After completing the required ritual, the clock emerged from the crawlway. And almost in the same instant, Despina and the Shadow Society also appeared, and with them, the captive parents of Maxwell and Melody.
Now, this arrival of the dark group in what should have been the Keep's safe haven immediately cast suspicion on Uncle Roland, particularly after Despina revealed that she and the Society of Shadows had been invited, and that she was paying Roland a handsome sum of money to deliver the Reaper King to her.
With Despina threatening to kill Arthur and Ellen, the kids were forced to use their keys to open the coffin clock. And as the assembled humans and monsters waited for the Reaper King to be released, which was to happen as the clock struck 12, the Warden Militia, in their true human forms, arrived on the scene.
Yeah, it turned out that Roland had actually called them, but they were not happy to see him. He had actually stolen their keys to the museum, and then he later sent those keys back to them via teleportation, the same time that he said, hey, come and help us. But even though he had summoned them, they still only saw him as a traitor. And as he tried to explain that the whole plot of Myriad Deceptions was in fact a collaboration with Arthur and Ellen to end the Society of Shadows once and for all, Whetstone condemned Roland to death for his traitorous behavior.
But Despina, not wanting to have the opportunity to kill Roland taken from her, started a brawl between the Society of Shadows and the Wardens. In the confusion of the ensuing melee, Roland, Melody, and Maxwell were able to retreat to regroup.
And once they had some distance, Roland at last told the kids everything. He and his brother Arthur had figured out, through translation of an ancient prophecy, that the Society of Shadows could be defeated, but only if they could be lured to the museum. But they knew that the Wardens were far too cautious to have ever been comfortable with such a plan.
So, Roland stole their keys, both to get access to the museum, but also to cause a rift that would get him expelled from the Order. After he was cast out, it was easy to convince Despina that he was willing to sell out the Wardens, but he hadn't counted on her learning about the kids being the only way to open the clock, and that was why Arthur and Ellen had been kidnapped as leverage against their children.
The entire ordeal and how wrong everything had gone had really taken its toll on Roland, who did not want to be involved any longer for fear that he was going to cause even more problems. He saw every failure of the plan as his personal failure. But the kids felt like they had no choice, so these two teenagers, who a mere week before had no idea about any such things as Wardens and a Reaper King and all of the other weird stuff that was going on, opted to leave their uncle and jump back into the fray to try to save their parents.
Maxwell came up with a plan to use a taming potion to rally the garden monsters to their cause. While he led his Flora army into engagement with the Society of Shadows, Melody worked to free Arthur and Ellen. And in the midst of it all, Roland, in something of a showboat maneuver, came riding in on an enchanted unicorn topiary to join the fight.
Yeah, he definitely had a flair for the dramatic. And I have to say, who wouldn't want to make that entrance? But once they were released from their captivity, the Keep parents, also joining the fight, corroborated Roland's story to the head warden. And as they're trying to explain this and fight at the same time, the clock began to chime 12. So the Reaper King began to emerge from his captivity in between moments, appearing slowly as a massive corporeal black shadow.
Despina was thrilled to have her king return to her, but he was not so much joyous as he was mad as hell. He was disappointed in the entire Society of Shadows for letting him remain captive for centuries, and he revoked the immortality he'd bestowed upon all of them and began killing each and every one of them personally.
Yeah, Despina was not immune to that. He was very angry with her. And as the Reaper King unfurled his wrath, Maxwell realized that in fact he had not fully emerged from the clock. It was something of a process for this shadow to sort of seep out. And he thought that maybe they would have a chance to once again capture him. Melody, who was too far away at this point because they were all fighting in different areas of this big, massive great room, threw her key to Maxwell, and then Maxwell quickly reinserted both keys into the eyes of the skull lock that was on the coffin clock, and once again, the Reaper King was indeed sucked back inside and locked in captivity.
With that, it was all over. The Reaper King had killed his own minions, with the exception of the Mistress Despina, who escaped but was no longer protected from death.
And the Keeps actually remained at the museum, watching over the supernatural curiosities and treasures that were housed there. Roland, this time, remained with the family, and he actually began to train Maxwell as a warden.
Of course, the trick with supernatural events in history is that they're almost impossible to verify. At this point, the only account we have of this episode in particular is a version written by Maxwell Keep. While the veracity of his story is certainly debatable, it's worth pausing to consider that if his writing is factual, the entire world narrowly escaped a harsh and swift end at the hands of the Reaper King.
Yeah, it certainly gives you pause to think about the fact that there could be these forces at work that we have no knowledge of, that never touch our lives in a way that we're conscious of, but in fact pose dangers to us all the time.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, you hear all the time about like, hey, remember that time we were this close to nuclear war? It's pretty much like that.
Kind of. Except the nuclear war involves a lot of mythical creatures that we've never seen before.
Yeah. So I don't think we've got any mail this episode, Holly.
Okay.
But where can people find you?
I'm easy to find. You can find me on Twitter as @surliestgirl, and you can also find my podcast Stuff You Missed in History Class across social media as @MissedInHistory. What about you?
I thought you were going to say I could find you behind me, and then I was going to get really freaked out.
Boo!
Yeah. You can find me on Twitter at Swankmatron, and on this show, and Holly and I do Full of Sith together, and you can find us there. And you can find my writing at brianyoungfiction.com, and you can support my short stories at Patreon, patreon.com/Swankmatron. And for Authentic History, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear mail from you. We would love to hear your comments and suggestions and letters. If you'd like to contact us, go to authentichistory.com and use the contact form, and that'll get to Holly and I. And you can listen to all of our back episodes there. And if you want to leave reviews for us on iTunes or Stitcher, wherever else you get podcasts, that would be great. You can find us on Twitter at Fauthentics and on Facebook at Fauthentic History. Is that it? Am I forgetting anything?
No, I think you've covered the gamut.
Do you have anything else for us?
No, just that I hope everyone stays safe and aware of all of the mystical monsters around them.
So that's it for this show. Thank you all for listening. And Holly, this was a great thing to learn about. I was fascinated.
Thank you.